So let me start with a question to John first. You guys mentioned several times about Vogtle experience in the United States. So presumably, when we talk about the risk associated with new nuclear builds, we're not talking about risk relating to the safety, but rather everyone is focusing about risk relating to cost overrun, like mostly financial risks. So what do you think will be the best way, and what kind of discussions are currently going on regarding a model to share risks among various players in the market?
Sure, that's an easy one. So I think that there are there've been several ways that this has been looked at, right? So first, I know of some of the technology companies who have explored sort of different EPC models. Let me step back, I guess. It's sharing the risk across the entire ecosystem of a nuclear plant development. What that looks like and how that's done, there are variations on the theme, I guess. So now, I've talked to folks at some nuclear technology, SMR companies. They propose to handle that in ways of sharing it across the equipment supplier, the engineering firms, the construction contractors themselves and their backers, and if it's a separate development company, that development company. I think I don't want to steal Chris's thunder here, but I think we've seen a variation on that proposed by Elemental Power, which also brings in the off-taker, the PPA counterparty. But essentially, you start talking. I can't help myself from talking with my hands. You start talking about levers, right? So, who's going to be the off-taker that agrees to a higher price? Who's going to agree to be the actual developer who takes a lower return? Who's going to be the engineering firm, the EPC firm, the construction firm that agrees to take on some of the cost overruns? That currently seems to be the most likely path forward for something like this. I mean, the other alternative, and something that I keep talking to people about, but no one bites, is whether or not there might be means of stretching out cost overruns. Is it a cost overrun facility? So, as folks have talked about, new nuclear facilities, and this is also true, I guess, with respect to transmission, although the cost overrun issue is less of a concern there, but they're 80-year assets or longer. So do you have financing arranged for sort of senior secured through 15, 20 years, and do you have a cost overrun facility that's available? There's been sort of a variation on that we heard Apollo provide for the EDF technology, the EDF plant that's being built in England. But is that a possibility? Whether that comes from sort of government backing or insurance companies who might be able to withstand the sort of long outlay of capital. But as I said, no one is biting at this. The more likely scenario is a couple of things, right? And I don't know what you're going to ask Chris. Chris is not going to have anything to talk about. So Vogtle in the U.S., part of the problem was, and this is definitely true, I can attest from the time that Chris and I spent trying to develop nuclear plants, people want to talk about how cheap it is, right? And so I would actually laugh at folks within my company for talking about an overnight cost for a new nuclear project that was $3,500 per kilowatt. That was laughable even in 2006 when coal plants cost $3,000 a kW. So the cost overruns start to look much worse if you're more realistic about what your starting point is a point that Chris has made to me. So, and we also in the U.S. sort of, at least for AP 1000s, have a high side of how bad things could go. It should be Vogtle. It shouldn't be worse than that. They were the first nuclear plants built in decades in the U.S. And got completed. When you get to that point, then maybe you can start to sort of, goalpost, fence post, like how bad things are going to be, and try and manage that again with what we heard, elementals looking to do to sort of pull different levers across the whole ecosystem. That seems to be the most likely because, again, no one's biting and providing 40-year cost overrun facilities.
I guess, Chris, you might want to add something to that. Like, Elemental essentially building a model that allows every players in the ecosystem to share their share of the risks.
Yeah, so we term it everybody bleeds, nobody dies. And what that means is, we should certainly be doing better than Vogtle in terms of an experience. And if we do, say, $12,000 a KW, the developer makes 3 to 5x MOIC on their development capital. The construction equity makes 15 to 19% on their construction equity. The long-term equity that owns the operating asset makes 8 to 10%, and the off-taker, Google, pays $120 a megawatt hour. If you have, instead of 12,000, you have 17,000, which is Vogtle, well, okay, the developer doesn't get 3 to 5x MOIC, he gets 1.2. The EPC and OEM, they don't make their 5 and 30% margins, they make, 1 and 10. The construction equity doesn't make 15 and 19%, they make 8 to 12%. The off-taker doesn't pay 120, they pay 150. All those things are the leverage you have to have people across that whole ecosystem bleed but not die from that project. And that works on it because we've modeled that when we proposed to acquire the VC summer site. So all that flexibility I talked about of people's willingness to pay for pricing, people's willingness to take a haircut in their returns, people's willingness to shave their margins, are all things that are livable. But you have to get to that point where everybody is giving something as part of it, and you can't expect any one person to bear all of it. So that is how we've gone about resolving the problem. But to think about just about the overrun dollar, so in the United States, if you have ITC, that overrun dollar, you get 30 to 50% of it back in an ITC, an operation. 75 to 80% of it can be financed with Department of Energy Dominance Financing Office. And they will provide that capital. That's how Vogtle got done. They kept on lending money, right? And generally speaking, if these projects get completed, they are long-term good economic assets, but you have to complete them. That was the problem with VC Summer. They stopped. There wasn't a DOE loan program office loan facility there to finance it. So they didn't have the wherewithal to do so. So to me, it's a scary problem, but it's not one of we're going to put people out of business. It's going to be one of we're all going to bleed a little bit and not expect any one party to take off more risk than they should. And that fundamentally is what happened at Vogtle, is they put too much risk on one party. They took it, they went bankrupt, caused all sorts of problems. If they just had a more realistic starting point and actually had done some things right, just basic 101, have the plant designed before you go out in the field. Pretty simple stuff, but it wasn't what happened. Don't make a lot of changes to the design. What was going on in China is like the Westinghouse was showing up with more design changes, and the Chinese basically said, yeah, we're not making that change. We're going to build the thing that you gave us, and that's it. And they were able to complete their plants even though they started later. So, there's a lot of lessons learned from Vogtle. You can either learn them or ignore them. We're choosing to learn them. And we know that even in the construct that we're putting together, that even if we do know better than Vogtle, which again, that's the high side, we have a model in which people can come out of it and say, don't like the experience, but we're still alive.
So my next question is to Mr. Sohn. I mean, this is relating to the risk sharing as well, But like as Chris mentioned, it looks like the U.S. government is sharing some risk by providing funding and also allowing tax credit, which essentially deplete their tax revenue basis if the project blows up, right? So from the Korean company's perspective or government perspective, you briefly touched on, we have to think about potential risk associated with the new nuclear power plants or new transmission line builds. But you also mentioned about the Korean team's kind of core strength that might touch on slightly on cost overrun, related risks. So what do you think is the core strength of the Korean Team Korea that can potentially allow or mitigate some of the risk associated with this new bill?
제가 이제 생각할 때는 미국 정부가 텍스에 대한 페이버를 주거나 여러 가지 이제 리스크를 떠안는 구조로 아마 세팅을 할 것 같아요. 그리고 우리 이제 대미투자 특별법에 의해서도 정부가 그런 리스크를 일부 떠안는 구조가 될 것이고, 무엇보다 이제 시작하는 관점에서 보면 이 파이낸스적인 측면에서 우리가 특히 이제 대형 원전, SMR도 마찬가지죠. SMR도 사실은 지금 초도기가 상용화된 상태가 아니기 때문에 파이낸스적으로 이거를 들어오는 데가 쉽지는 않거든요. 근데 그런 과정에서 이제 초기에 들어가는 거는 이제 큰 리스크, 과거보다 훨씬 좋은 환경일 것이고, 또 무엇보다 NRC, 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 NRC나 DOE의 규제가 굉장히 심하기 때문에 그거를 지금 상황에서 뚫고 가지 않으면 사실 다음에 기회가 없다. 저는 이렇게 생각을 합니다. 근데 이제 제가 이제 좀 의문점을 갖고 있는 거는 설계 변경이 없을 수가 없는 비즈니스 영역이에요. 여기가 원전은 지으면서 계속 변경되는 비즈니스고, 그 설계가 변경되고 이 적용되는 코드도 계속 변경될 수밖에 없기 때문에 사실 처음에 예상했던 그 버짓하고 실제 준공할 때의 버짓하고 그다음에 정비 운영을 해서 한 4년 돌린 다음에 버짓하고 이게 다르단 말이에요. 근데 그런 장기적인 플랜으로 운영되는 프로젝트이기 때문에 사실은 그거를 공평하게 마진을 쉐어하는 구조를 짠다는 것이 사실 좀 쉽지는 않은 것 같아요. 물론 미국 정부에서 여러 가지 혜택을 주기 때문에 그런 것까지 포함해서 투자를 하고 참여를 하겠지만, 이제 그 프로젝트를 끝낸 이후에 누가 손해를 보고 누가 이윤을 갖게 되느냐의 문제는 또 다른 문제거든요. 우리가 이제 UAE 원전에서 굉장히 성공적인 원전이에요. 우리가 한전에 이제 부사장님도 와 계시지만 굉장히 성공적인 원전이죠. 그리고 이제 UAE가 오리코기를 지으면 우리가 이제 또 하기를 바라는 그런 모델인데, 그럼에도 불구하고 엔액, 그러니까 UAE의 이제 에너지 공기업인 엔액하고 한전하고 또 한수원하고 KPS 이 구조에서 여러 손실을 서로 떠안게 되는 문제가 있잖아요. 그래서 중재도 하게 되는 것이고, 그러니까 이런 후발적인 리스크를 사실 예상을 해야 된다는 거죠. 그러니까 프랑스 EDF 같은 데가 핀란드에서 그렇게 고생하는 이유가 그 변화를 컨트롤할 수 있는 능력이 없는 회사인 거죠. 대신에 코리아 팀은 그걸 이제 UAE에서 그걸 감내하면서 그 여러 가지 문제들을 돌발 상황들을 잘 컨트롤하면서 끝냈는데, 프로젝트는 잘 끝내고 정비 운영도 하고 5.4기가와트 APR 1400을 4기를 만들었는데, 이제 그거는 그거고, 그럼 수익을 어떻게 배분하느냐의 문제는 또 다른 문제일 것 같아요. 그래서 이제 말씀하신 대로 이런 부분에 있어서 미국이 파이낸스적으로 굉장히 발전돼 있기 때문에 그런 부분들을 잘 짜서 그런 변화하는, 그러니까 돌발 상황, 돌발 리스크들에 대해서 해지시키는 모델들을 만드는 역할을 해주셔야 되지 않을까. 근데 우리 입장에서는 사전적인 그 배리어들이 사실 많이 약화됐기 때문에 당연히 들어가야 되는 시장이라고 생각합니다.
So I guess what you're essentially saying is the Korean government and the Korean companies are willing to take some risk by promising, or not, maybe guarantee, maybe too strong words, but giving some assurance that the project will be built on budget and on schedule. I mean, which is a huge thing, right? To that effect, maybe this is a little bit of curveball, but the Korean companies have a lot of experience on APR 1400, so they can probably feel very comfortable building those projects and reactors on time and on budget. But what about AP 1000? Like, the U.S. governments are thinking about like AP 1000 as a kind of main model, for the new nuclear power plants. Is there any possibility, do you think, Chris, for the U.S. government consider APR 1400
No.
to mitigate?
The administration we have right now is what it is, and for the points of it, it's going to be U.S. technology and USA first. That could change, but I don't see that being realistic. That said, at NuScale, we had investors and participants from Korea, supply chain, so Doosan, Samsung C&T, others that had both the financial investment and a strategic return in terms of scope of projects that were being provided by NuScale. And it was a proportion to the investment. So I do think that there is a way to participate in a way that's meaningful, because in fact, you're generally already in a lot of the supply chains to begin with. And we were driven that way at NuScale, certainly on the manufacturing side. But then, the U.S. market, while it looks big, last I checked, most of the world lives outside of the United States. And electricity generally follows population in terms of demand. So to the extent that it's just seen as an opportunity limited to the United States, it's not attractive. But to the extent you see it being a footprint from which you build and go out and get the rest of the 95% of the market that's outside of the United States, people-wise, it's a great opportunity because there's many people who aren't going to lead in parts of the world where Korea is leading. Asia Pacific or other parts. You're not going to find U.S. EPC firms leading in that regard in the same way that the Koreans or even the Japanese would. So I've always been a proponent of, bring together the people that can do it and then shift the responsibilities around and expect to have a larger opportunity set based upon using Western technologies. And I say the Western technologies because from a U.S. geostrategic standpoint, it's about whether or not you want to have countries being influenced by Russia or China through their programs versus being influenced by the U.S., Japan, Korea, or other Western democracies. That's kind of what's going on. So I think there's a great opportunity. It's a huge market. You just can't expect to make all your money on the first project. That's always the challenge that people have, is that it's more than just one project. Thankfully for Elemental with Google, they recognize that, right? It's not just one project, it's 3 projects of 600 megawatts apiece minimum. So there's at least 6 reactors there. I'm sure if you did Baraka and you stopped at 1, probably would have not been the overall cost divided by 4. It probably would have been a bigger part of the overall cost. Mm-hmm. Doing the 1, 2, 3, 4 is what gets you down. And the same was true at Vogtle. It was 30% cheaper in terms of man hours for Vogtle 4 versus Vogtle 3. That kind of tells you how that works in practice of being able to do the repetition on it. And so if we could just do that, 1, have a plan, 2, stick to it, and 3, repeat it, as opposed to keep on monkeying around with it. Like, geez, if I only did this, it'd be a little bit better. We don't need a little bit better. We need to do it repetitive and reliably and predictably throughout all these things, and I think we'll be successful.
So creating an economy of scales is the key in terms of, sharing the risk and making money out of it, I guess.
It's really replication, right? I mean, scale says I just make the same thing but a lot bigger. I'm talking about breadth. I'm doing the same thing multiple times.
Scaling the numbers, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah. Okay, so maybe, John, Mr. Son mentioned about like potential kind of legal considerations that the Korean company has to think about, like CFIUS and VERG. What other legal considerations or structures or strategy that you think the Korean company should think about before they, go to the U.S. market?
It's hard to answer because it's so highly dependent on how Korean companies want to invest, right? I mean,
Right, a little bit of open-ended questions, I admit, but
yeah. If what they're looking is to help be like a supply chain, a supplier, then it's very little, right? And that ramps up to somehow honest to goodness partnering so that you end up with the business ownership issue that is CFIUS, and ramps up, even beyond that, at least in terms of the heightened scrutiny, to the point that they do what EDF did with us at Constellation, which is that they actually own. The concerns, the things that I think Korean companies will need to be concerned about are stuff that are by and large obvious to everybody at this point. It's tariff, it's administration instability is the problem that everyone's dealing with. It's tariffs, it's reviews that aren't being done on the basis of reasonableness, right? It's the whims of an administration that may decide that it's going to try to influence that kind of review. Having said that, on the positive side, the desire to have new nuclear projects get built is so high. So Secretary Wright, I think within the first couple of weeks, put out an order, saying essentially, nuclear is back. So it strikes me that it's sort of incumbent on companies that want to play in the industry in the U.S. that they demonstrate that they're bringing something to bear. The Trump administration clearly wants that with the $350 billion trade accord. But I think it's being mindful that things can change fairly quickly. But so you map out where you want to be and go from there. You want a JV, then you're gonna have to deal with CFIUS and you're gonna have to deal with the administration. You want to just be an equipment supplier or a technology advisor or something like that, then you have reduced scrutiny but potentially lower returns. And
relatively obvious at this point, but it is more of a streamlining the business decisions and adapting to or continue to monitor new developments and adapting to different strategies.
I would, to the extent either of the folks up here think differently, but that would be my take. Yeah, it's highly dependent on sort of how you see yourself.
Got it. Mr. Son, do you want to add on that point?
이런 부분이 있는 것 같아요. 지금 미국 수출하는 기업의 입장에서 단순히 단기적으로 수출 케이블이 됐든 변압기가 됐든 수출해서 단기적인 마진을 얻는 그런 구조가 아니고 장기적으로 그 서플라이 체인, 미국의 서플라이 체인에 이 제품을 공급하는 인프라의 제품을 공급하는 이제 플랫폼 기업으로 그 자리에 매김할 수 있어야 되거든요. 그거는 원전도 마찬가지입니다. 우리가 코리아 팀의 많은 멤버들, 스테이크홀더들이 그 미국 시장에 참여해서 단순히 단기적으로 생산을 하고 나오는 구조가 아니고 그 미국 원전 생태계에서 역할을 할 수 있도록 미국 정부가 그런 규제를 풀어줘야 됩니다. 그러니까 예를 들면 CPUS에 있어서 우리가 JV를 만드는데 한국 지금 사업 기업들의 투자 지분을, 그러니까 경영권 지분을 50%는 아니더라도 적어도 40%에 근접하게는 허용을 해줘라. 그래서 거기에 그 자본을 태우고 그 생태계에서 실제 역할을 할 수 있도록 구조를 좀 풀어주는 것이 사실은 필요하다고 생각합니다. 그러니까 대미투자 특별법이나 미국 정부에서 원전 프로젝트를 하는 현재의 상황은 그런 초기에 있어서의 여러 가지 NRC의 규제 이슈들을 푸는 데는 좋은 이점이 있고 파이낸스적으로도 좋지만 결국 장기적으로 한미 원자력 관련 협력 체계 또는 한미 전력 산업에 있어서 협력 체계를 유지하려고 하면 한국의 플레이어들이 미국 시장에 투자하면서 어느 정도 경영적인 판단을 할 수 있는 구조를 허락해 줘야 되는 게 필요한 것 같아요. 제가 일을 해보니까 그 CPUS 상의 여러 좀 승인 절차나 이런 것들이 번잡하고 또 특히 원전과 관련된 기술적인 전략 기술적인 부분이 있기 때문에 엄격하게 하는데 어쨌든 한미 뭐 계속 우리가 공동 협력하에서 장기적으로 이 플랜을 가져가는 거거든요. 10년, 20년 돌리고 마는 게 아니고 사실 60년을 보고 원전을 짓는 겁니다. 그렇게 된다고 하면은 약간 그런 부분에 있어서 한국 기업들에게 투자에 있어서의 메리트를 단순히 마진을 가져오는, 그러니까 수익을 내는 단기 프로젝트가 아니고 장기적으로 그 생태계에서 한국 기업이 역할을 할 수 있도록 그런 부분들을 미국 정부에서 좀 더 적극적으로 풀어줄 필요가 있고, 그거는 뭐 한미 동맹의 신뢰에 기반하겠지만 그런 역할을 좀 기대해 봅니다.
I'm going to wrap it up with final questions to each of you. So, if you name one thing as a key takeaway from our program today, what would that be? Starting with Chris.
The key takeaway for me, or at least the key lesson, is that there's a once-in-a-century opportunity in the United States that can be leveraged and used to the benefit of U.S., Korean companies to really make a difference in the U.S. and then the rest of the world. We were involved in Renaissance 1.0. I really hope this Renaissance sticks. I want to see it through. I want to see it go, and I want to work with the people in this room to make it happen in the United States and make it happen in other parts of the world, whether it's Eastern, Central Europe, Asia Pacific, wherever it may be. Let's start going working together on this, hand in hand, and make it happen. And I'm encouraged to see all the folks here. This is great.
I'm not sure that I have anything that's much different than that. I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is again, the U.S. hasn't developed a new nuclear project other than Vogtle in 40 years, I think. I can't remember, is it STP or Cherokee, but in the 80s was the last one that was completed. And there's an administration that sometimes is not always the easiest to read. I guess I'd say to sort of keep in mind that things may move through fits and starts. But assuming that the data center, the load growth, the demand is what it is projected to be, it's hard to see that this doesn't happen, that sort of the Renaissance 2.0 of nuclear doesn't happen. And given that, I mean, it's really hard to see that there aren't significant roles for Team Korea to play. I agree that it would be helpful for for some alliances at the intergovernmental level to be created that smooths that participation. But even absent that, I mean, I think that the opportunities are substantial, and so I would say, stick with the states. There may be some difficulties, but I think there are substantial opportunities that would make it worthwhile.
오늘 이렇게 좋은 자리 만들어주신 우리 딜사이트의 이승호 이사장님이나 관계자 여러분께 감사드리고, 무엇보다 이렇게 통찰력 있는 두 분의 그러니까 엘리멘틀 파워 또 메이어 브라운의 이런 귀중한 분들하고 통찰력 있는 토론을 할 수 있는 기회가 있어서 감사합니다. 사실은 우리에게 기회입니다. 우리가 우크라이나 전쟁하고 이란 전쟁을 겪으면서 우리에게 에너지가 얼마나 중요한지를 새삼 깨달았고, 우리가 가지고 있는 이 현재까지 구축한 에코시스템이 얼마나 경쟁력이 있는지를 여러분들이 깨달으셨을 겁니다. 그 경쟁력을 잘 활용해 가지고 미국 시장에서도 여러분들이 성공적인 비즈니스를 하시길 바랍니다.